Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Larry Stutzream, Director of Research at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Today, Mitchell Institute is rolling out our newest policy paper. It's titled, Want Combat Air Power? Then Fix the Air Force Pilot Crisis. And it's by our resident fellow, Heather Penny. The Air Force's ability to fly, fight, and win certainly depends on the quality and quantity of its aircraft inventory. Makes sense. But the most important component of America's air power is the pilot force, and more specifically, both the quality and quantity of pilots who must fly, fight, and win. Today, however, the Air Force's pilot force is too small, and it's poorly structured to be the force required to prevail in peer conflict. The Air Force has suffered a persistent pilot shortage for decades. At the same time, the Air Force has a shortage of experienced pilots, and this is most acute in the fighter pilot force. The situation is alarming because history teaches us that without a strategic depth, that is quantity, of experienced pilots, air forces collapse under the pressures of high-intensity combat operations. As the Air Force prepares for the return of a highly contested fight with a peer adversary, it is imperative that the service corrects both its shortage of pilots and especially experienced pilots. The solution must span what's called the total Air Force, both the active component and the reserve components. If not, the nation's ability to achieve air superiority is at risk. And without air superiority, no joint military operation can succeed. So this report provides a flight plan for restoring the pilot force. And we are fortunate to discuss the report and its recommendations. I'm joined by its author, Heather Penny. Lucky is a senior resident fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Welcome, Lucky.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here.
You bet. And I'd also like to introduce two special guests who are going to join us for today's discussion. First, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant General Joseph Gus Guastella. He's retired Air Force. He's a pilot with an illustrious career. Before retiring from the Air Force, he served as the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. And we're also fortunate to be joined by Lieutenant General Mark Sasseville. He's also retired. He has an equally illustrious career, and he's also a fighter pilot and a longtime Air National Guardsman. Before he retired, General Sasseville served as the nation's 12th Vice Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thanks, Sass. Heather, great to see you.
Thanks, Stutz. Good to see you and team.
Great to have you. Heather, well, this is an important effort. So how about you give us a spin through the report, and then we'll get to some questions. And before you start, as a note to our audience, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A window anytime during the discussion, and we'll get those at the back end of the program. So over to you, Heather.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for joining us here today for our rollout of Want Combat Air Power? Then Fix the Air Force's Pilot Crisis. We embarked on this project because while we here at Mitchell often focus on the Air Force's aircraft inventory being the smallest and oldest and least ready that it's ever been, none of the aircraft matter if we don't have pilots to fly and employ them. So it comes down to mission success. If we don't have experienced fighter pilots, we risk the outcome not just of the mission, but the entire operation or even the war. So this report is about how to increase the quantity of experienced fighter pilots in the force to increase the strategic depth of the Air Force. Fighter pilots represent roughly 50% of the service's overall pilot shortfall, which makes this demographic impactful and one that can potentially provide insight into other pilot specialties. If you look at the life cycle of pilots, it takes about 5 years to produce an experienced fighter pilot. To give you an idea of how much that is, a new F-35 pilot has to fly 250 sorties, earn their 4-ship flight leave qualification, and complete 60 simulator sorties before they qualify as experienced. But we can't wait 5 years. We must build the fight tonight force with enough strategic depth to successfully sustain combat operations in a peer fight. We are out of time, and we must have a sense of urgency because if we don't, we risk losing. The Air Force has suffered this chronic shortfall for over 20 years, and the shortfall has only grown, even as aircraft and pilot inventories have gone down. The fighter pilot shortfall has held steady at over 1,000 for several years. This is not good. And the regular Air Force has had a pretty consistent retention rate of about 45%, which means that in any given year, more than half the pilots eligible to leave do. And those who leave are the experienced pilots, the most valuable ones in combat. The Air Force has coped with the shortfall by shortchanging the headquarters staffs, campaign planning, joint staff, combatant commands, and requirements and acquisitions so they can fill squadrons, the cockpits. But this is just a Band-Aid and one that hurts the leadership of the Air Force and the Joint Force. If you want sound strategy, operational concepts, war planning, good technical decisions, you need to have the experts in the room. But the Air Force has been unable to produce its way out of the shortfall. The aircraft there in pilot training are old and fragile, and it means they're not able to fly the sorties needed to produce enough new pilots. I mean, we can't even produce pilots for our steady state requirements today. And even the fighter training units have throughput constraints as well. This should be a cautionary signal to service leadership, and it may be an indicator that the service would be unable to replace combat losses in a pure fight. So I keep saying that we need strategic depth, but what does that mean? Strategic depth is about how force size, numbers, and experience, that's the expertise, can buy you time. The nation needs enough jets and experienced pilots to fight through combat losses and sustain successful and operationally effective missions until replacements can be produced, trained, and seasoned. We cannot afford to go the way of the Luftwaffe and the Japanese Imperial Air Forces of World War II, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But before I do, I know there's been a lot of talk of replacing pilots with autonomous aircraft. Let me just say that while we are big fans of autonomous systems, we do not believe that they can replace human pilots in the battle space. The strength and value of autonomous systems is in their collaboration with humans, in teaming. It's not an either or, it's an and. But here for this paper, we're focused on just one half of this equation, and that's the pilots. Here's why experience and the strategic depth matters. History has proven that air forces that are thin, that is, they're small, and they lack experience, collapse in combat. And as I mentioned, the German Luftwaffe and the Japanese Imperial Air Forces of World War II are classic and instructive examples. Both nations had a very small core of highly trained, very experienced combat pilots, and both countries, based on their experience of their outstanding performance of their air power, expected that future conflicts would yield light casualties and be quickly won. Sound familiar? But they did not have the strategic depth of force that would build the time and buffer that they needed to replace their operational losses. Attrition took its toll, and for example, by 1942, Germany had lost the equivalent of 2 air forces worth of pilots. And as those losses mounted, both countries had to decrease their training flying hours and to increase their rate of pilot production. They ate their seed corn. Less skilled pilots died faster, and this created an accelerating and vicious cycle of losses. These lessons should be clear. In a high intensity and protracted conflict, air forces must have strategic depth and experienced pilots. And General Alvin said it. America needs more Air Force, and it needs it now. In the FY25 Air Force budget request, the Air Force seek to procure 90 aircraft, but divest 250. That's the wrong direction, and it represents a death spiral. The Air Force must begin growing its fighter force to defend the homeland, sustain high rotational demands by combatant commanders, stabilize and deter recidivist Russia, and deter and be ready to prevail against China. We have been too small for too long, and this has taken a toll on our force. Whether it's aged out airframes, low mission capable rates, decreasing dwell times, or burnt out pilots that are walking, the Air Force is too small for its current peacetime requirements. We must build a strategic depth to meet today's and the future's global strategic challenges. In the Cold War, we were a smaller force than the Soviets, but our technology was better and our pilots flew more and were better trained. Today, our force is smaller, fractured across multiple theaters, our aircraft are old, and we're flying less than the Chinese. This is a recipe for losing. So, how do you build an experienced pilot? You fly them. but units are struggling to hit their minimum requirements. RAP is the Ready Aircrew program. It details how squadrons are to manage their flying training of their pilots. Every pilot has a number of sorties and simulators they need to fly each month to stay combat mission ready, and their status in turn impacts the squadron's combat readiness. Four factors really impact a squadron's ability to keep their pilots and therefore themselves ready. The first is how many pilots are in the squadron. This dictates the minimum sorties the squadron must generate to keep everyone qualified. The second is how many experienced pilots a squadron has to new guys. This impacts how they can schedule the flights. New pilots often have to fly with an instructor or other squadron supervision. So if there are not enough experienced pilots, these new pilots might not fly as much as they need to. The third is how many sorties a squadron can generate. This is a direct result of how many jets that squadron possesses and how healthy those jets are. Healthy jets with high mission capable rates can fly more, which means more sorties. Weary jets fly less and can mean the squadron might not be able to fly everyone at their minimum requirement. And finally, simulators. Pilots must be able to fly certain missions that cannot be executed on existing training ranges. And this could be for a variety of reasons. It might be a lack of modern threat systems on those training ranges, or even us not wanting to reveal that we have certain capabilities in open air. So these four things impact a pilot's readiness and a squadron's readiness. It's important to note that this RAP is intended to be a minimum, but because of low mission capable rates across the entire fighter fleet, they are too often treated as the objective, no more. But this is having a negative impact on pilot experience rates. The active component is struggling in many units to provide the absorption of their new fighter pilots. Squadrons are often too thin in experience or unable to provide the sorties needed. So the number of jets and their mission capable rates directly affects how often pilots can fly. On the left, you can see how much the fighter force has shrunk. These bars represent fighter inventory. It begins in 1989, 1999 to today, 2024. It's shocking to see how small the Air Force's fighter inventory is, especially when you take out test and training and then factor in mission capable rates. That effective fighter fleet is essentially about 750 aircraft. That's what we have to train with, and that's what we have to go to war. On the right, you can see the average mission capable rates of the fighter fleet. This is a result of a combination of aged aircraft and resourcing. Older aircraft break more often, require more and more intensive maintenance, which equals downtime, and spare parts are harder to come by and so on. So for these reasons, they're also more expensive to sustain. And resourcing matters. For too long, sustainment accounts have been rated for other service priorities. Replacing old aircraft, to be clear, replacing old aircraft is the only way to resolve the aging aircraft crisis. But until that happens, we have to fully fund these sustainment accounts to get these aircraft flying for the fight tonight. Because producing and absorbing pilots is imperative. But for the fight tonight, the fastest way to grow a strategic reserve of experienced pilots is the reserve component. To get that depth, we need to train and retain. We need it all. It's hard to produce and absorb new pilots to grow the force. You're not going to see the effect of that for years, but we don't have to start at zero to get to hero. The reserve component has held retention rates of over 80% for its fighter pilots for the last 20 years. Compare that to 45% for the active component. So as you look at this graph, the blue bars are the fighter pilot inventory, how many fighter pilots are in this case, the Air National Guard. Orange are the number who leave the Guard, and that gray line is the retention rate. Total inventory of reserve fighter pilots has been coming down over the years because reserve fighter squadrons have been closed. But the RC's consistently high retention rates mean that the reserve component can keep the talent that it recruits, which ensures that investments that are made to mature these pilots when they're in the active component are not lost to the total force. This means the reserve component has the ability to season and absorb new pilots that are in the active component. By embedding these young fighter pilots with the experience of the reserve component, the reserve can help close the gap that the nation needs. The Air Force must not underestimate the expertise and operational value of the reserve component in creating the strategic depth and combat-ready reserve that the nation needs in peer conflict. But if we're going to retain the experienced pilots that exit the active component, they need a place to land. But reserve units, because they often have the oldest aircraft in the total force, are also the most at risk of closure. What you see here is a snapshot of the 25 remaining Air National Guard fighter squadrons. And of the 25, only 10 have a recapitalization plan. And 2 units have already been told that they're losing their flying mission: Selfridge, Michigan, and Martin State in Baltimore, Maryland. These are pilots and cockpits that will be lost totally to the total force. The other 13 units, the red and the orange dots, they remain in a limbo because they have the oldest legacy fighters in the total force. They are still at risk because the Air Force is not procuring new aircraft fast enough. And without that one-for-one replacement in the near term, divesting these aircraft would result in a major loss in combat capacity and experienced fighter pilots if they're not replaced. Shuttering fighter squadrons across the reserve component will further stress the active component's forces, which are already too small to need. To get the active component healthy, we need to ensure the reserve component remains healthy too. Because General Alvin was right, America needs more Air Force now. This isn't just about airplanes, it's about pilots. We must have the strategic depth of experienced pilots to successfully sustain combat operations and prevail in a protracted conflict. To that end, Mitchell presents 5 major recommendations to begin to build and sustain that strategic depth in the fight tonight force. And the first is the U.S. Air Force should grow its active component fighter forces to increase the quantity and rate at which it can absorb new pilots and maintain their combat status. And this means replacing old aircraft with new at a one-for-one rate. We cannot divest to invest. That is a bankrupt strategy. Second, the Air Force should preserve and grow the number of its reserve component fighter squadrons and increase the number of fighters assigned to each of those squadrons. Most of the reserve component squadrons have 18 possessed aircraft, but the active component has 24. The Air Force should grow the reserve component up to 24 and then leverage these reserve squadrons to absorb new active component pilots that are graduating from their initial fighter qualification courses. Third, the Air Force should recapitalize and modernize its combat forces to improve the mission-capable rates of its fleet. Remember what I said about older aircraft having, breaking more often, being more expensive to sustain? The only way to fix that is a one-for-one replacement with new aircraft. And if production rates and expansions of F-35 cannot be scaled at the rate necessary, the service should consider procuring advanced models of F-16s and increasing F-15EXs to replace these legacy airframes to prevent squadron closures. And the service must also fully fund weapon system accounts. Fourth, the Air Force should recapitalize and modernize its active and reserve components concurrently. There is an interdependency between the two services that must be honored. But importantly, the reserve component must be modernized concurrently with the active component to preserve the interchangeability of forces that are presented to combat commanders. And fifth, the U.S. Air Force must ensure that its advanced simulators are connected to the joint simulation environment and are available to all squadrons for daily training operations. Those simulators are very important for training and preserving those high-end capabilities for pilots, but they must be available to all squadrons. The nation cannot wait. It must begin building the strategic depth of experienced combat pilots now so that we can successfully sustain, combat operations for the peer fight. Thank you.
Heather, that was a great presentation, and those recommendations are powerful. So before we get into some additional, detail here, I really want to give the generals a chance to just kind of give us, initial thoughts regarding Heather's paper and the presentation. And how about General Guastella? We'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Dutch. For starters, that was a fantastic paper and presentation. Heather, hats off to you and Mitchell for doing this, to really roll up such a critical set of issues for the listener that's out there today. And I agree with General Alvin. And because right from one of your major themes is the Air Force has insufficient capacity and capability for the nation. But you don't have, if you're a listener that's an Air Force advocate, sure, it's easy to convince you. But the listeners here that are not necessarily in the Air Force or maybe congressional decision makers, you don't have to listen to the Air Force here to believe, or to be led to believe that we need to be bigger. Listen to the joint force. Listen to the demands of the combatant commanders that are asking for air power. The demand for air power is not diminished. While that bar graph that Heather showed, the depleted fighter force structure plummeting down, guess what? The demand signal hasn't done. It hasn't gone down. So we're just today, we're needed in deterrence operations in Europe. The Middle East is not changing. It's as turbulent as ever. And then certainly we all know the demands from the Asia theater, not to mention the importance of homeland defense. The solution for all of that is air power. And so that underpins that entire argument right there. But if the Air Force was a patient in the hospital, right, and had a lot of problems, probably the core issue at the heart of the patient is the pilot shortfall. Because it doesn't matter if you're a fighter advocate or a bomber advocate or an ISR advocate or a tanker or a mobility, it doesn't matter what your passion is. At the core of all of it are pilots that fly those airplanes, pilots that put themselves in danger, pilots that don't come home on combat missions, and pilots that risk their lives, and pilots that are familiar with the application of force and can articulate how best to use air power. And so when we have a shortage of pilots, we hurt in experience. We're not as capable, just like Heather said, when we go and fight the combat, just as at the end of World War II, how horrible it was for the German Air Force because they had no experienced pilots. Horrible for them, good for us. But we don't want to be in that situation. And it's also very bad when we don't have pilots sufficient to inform the staffs that are out there. And so so the solution, as was said, is to produce more pilots for at least 10 years to get out of this and make the best use of our total force. This is an active guard reserve mix that we have to work together on to get out of this problem. But I really look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Hey, great comments, General. General Sasseville, how about you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Stutz, and great to be with you. I appreciate you all inviting me here to Mitchell to talk about this extremely important conversation, or topic rather, and it's especially an honor to do it with such great longstanding friends. So I'm all about it, and I look forward to going through the paper, which, by the way, I thought was fantastic, very well written, gets to the crux of the matter, and I appreciate the way that you, Lucky, kind of focused it. You didn't try to boil the entire ocean. I've been involved with trying to fix this pilot shortfall since 2017, I want to say. And there were some real honest attempts made by the Air Force back then to address it. But this is a super complicated endeavor. And that goes to why it hasn't been fixed so far. So I was reading it. I had a couple of thoughts. You've already mentioned it, and Gus touched on it as well. But I'd like to foot stomp it because I want to tie it more closely to this idea of, and the idea is, why do we need fighter pilots, right? The idea that we can just use drones. You've heard about that in the news, right? We don't need the pilots to be actually in the airplane anymore. We can just use drones and CCA and everything will be fine. And that's actually not the case, as we all know, but we need to communicate it to everybody else who is trying to help us with building the world's greatest Air Force. And the fact of the matter is, you need the skill sets, you need the experience to not only be in the cockpits teaching the follow-on crop of pilots, but you also need them on the stabs, working the requirements, the future requirements. And it's not glorious work, and we've been pulling from the staffs for a long time, but they are filling very important duties, writing policy on how are you going to maintain this force. Like Gus said, they're at the COCOMs planning the campaigns, right? Planning the attacks for large scale packages, they are the experts and the practitioners of violence. And that's fundamentally what we're really about. That might not be popular, but essentially that's what an Air Force does. And I will also include, even though the paper is really focused on the fighter aspect of it, this applies to bomber crews and combat search and rescue and special ops. So I think there are a lot of things that can be drawn from the paper and how it's presented, and the idea of maintaining capacity in the reserve component to help with the experience level, to help regenerate in large scale combat operations, which we haven't done in a long time. We're thinking hard about how to do it now. We haven't had to do it, but if we are going to end up in a large scale combat operation, we really need to think about the attrition across the board of the warrior class. The other thing that came to mind was this idea of, why do you need the reserve component? Traditionally, in a military operation, you want a reserve so that you can commit once the engaged forces are either at a turning point of either going to complete victory or at a danger point. You commit your reserve. And the way the Air Forces have used reserves is obviously quite different for good reasons. Yes, there is capacity, right? There is an amount of capacity that we, the Air Force, keep in our reserve component, but it's also more than that. I call it mission swing space. So as the Air Force wants to modernize, but not completely lose a capability that it's had, you can put that into the reserve component and hang on to it as you transition from one capability to the other. But the other more important, I think, aspect of having a well-funded, well-functioning reserve component is this idea of retaining talent. And we'll talk probably a little bit more about that, but the experience base that sits in the reserve component is absolutely crucial, as is one of the fundamental pieces of this paper. And we need to be able to retain that and feed it and grow it. And then finally, I really like the historical, I'll wrap up with this here at the beginning. I really like the historical lessons, right? The best lessons are the ones that you don't have to learn firsthand, especially if they're rough, right? And we can learn from the Japanese and the German Air Forces, where they didn't think that the conflict was going to go on as long as it did. They could survive what they had, and that's not the way things turned out for them. So let's not make the same mistake. Back to you, Stutz.
Thanks, General. And by the way, for the Israelis also in the recent year-long or over a year-long engagement, they were not quite prepared to fight as long, and that required some real work. So the great opening comments for all. We need some background, Heather. The broader public probably assumes that all the Air Force needs to do is recruit more pilots to fix the shortage problem. It seems so easy. But you discuss in your report, it's a little more complicated. Do you mind explaining why that's the case?
I'll try to boil it down and be short, because if this problem were easy, the service would have been able to solve it by now. Yeah. But to be honest, the pilot shortfall that we see today began in the 1990s, when the Air Force began to cut its fighter forces and its overall force structure dramatically. Pilots were leaving, they were banking pilots. When they realized that they were facing a shortfall, they began to produce more pilots, but that as those pilots went into the squadrons, there were not enough experienced pilots to be able to absorb them. So you didn't have the instructor pilots and the supervision and the flight leads that had the ability to pass on their experience, provide that flying training supervision. And so you end up getting into a PIO, if you will, an induced oscillation, where you have too few, too many, too few, too many. When I say too many, it's more of a glut of pilot production. But remember, this is also a life cycle. So the pilots that are being produced today are not going to become experienced for another 5 years. So you have to, any move that you do today at the beginning of the pilot life cycle is going to take time to have effect. And as I said, we don't have time, which is one of the reasons why we scoped the study. We acknowledged that we have to fix the pilot recruitment and pilot training problem, which, by the way, has also been neglected because of fiscal constraints, which is one of the reasons why the service has been unable to produce the number of pilots and number of fighter pilots at the beginning of that life cycle is because those aircraft are old. The T-38 that provides advanced pilot training, advanced jet pilot training, that was built in the 1960s. So you can see how the neglect of investment and recapitalization we are now having to live with. So knowing that fixing the front end of the pilot training problem would take time, that's why we focused on, well, how can we solve the fight tonight challenge? And by growing the reserves and retaining that talent, that is a cost-effective way to ensure that we can have that talent available when the nation needs it. But it can't just be the reserves that get recapitalized or grown. We have to ensure that the active grows as well, because a major reason why pilots are leaving is because they're getting burnt out. They're being spun too hard, just like the jets are. Because as you mentioned, Stutz and Gus, the demand from the commanders hasn't gone down, it's gone up. So we're just spinning the active duty harder and harder. So we have to recapitalize and we have to grow both of those forces. And that's going to be the only way we can retain that talent.
Yeah, Heather, thanks. It really is understandable that it's a complex problem. And I'd like to kind of dwell on that for a second, build on that. And for you, General Guastella, given the complexity of the pilot crisis, can you just talk a little bit about why it's important to hang on to experienced pilots? And what does that experience mean for the health of a fighter squadron?
Yeah, it is absolutely critical. It's funny, Heather, before you said the Air Force was unable to fulfill the pilot shortfall. I would say that they've been unwilling, because it's a matter of resources and applying it. And they have difficult choices to make in the Air Force when they're underfunded as a force. But this is a core issue. The pilot thing is a core issue that is not fixed overnight. It's going to take a decade to fix this, since it's taken us over a decade to get into the situation, and it's acute. So, I came into a fighter squadron as a DO, Director of Operations, the number 2. And the leadership before me was very, very conservative. And when I showed up, there were only 3 instructors in the squadron: the weapons officer, myself, and the squadron commander. I was astonished, because I knew without instructor pilots, we couldn't do any upgrades. We couldn't produce 2-ship flight leads from wingmen. We couldn't make 4-ship flight leads, and we couldn't make more instructors. So while we immediately set off to try to create more instructors to up the level of experience that we could. The fortunate thing that we had back then, though, was the ability to fly. We could actually develop a schedule that could sustain a pretty robust flying schedule. And we flew our way out of our experience issue. Today, we struggle with inexperienced pilots, a shortfall, and we can't fly enough. So it's a perfect storm that we've arrived in. But I tell you, not having experience, you can live with it during peacetime. It's unfortunate, but boy, when it gets real fast when you go to war. And, I happened to be, as the DO of squadron at the time, we were called up to go to Iraqi Freedom Major, the initial campaign. And the other squadron wasn't ready to go, wasn't set to go. They'd come off another deployment. So it was going to be a 1-squadron deployment from the wing. And I asked the squadron commander, I go, hey, what's our options on pilots? And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, because I'm like, I want to take the best this wing has. So we've got one chance at this. Right? We took 12 jets, we had a 2.0 crew ratio, and we flat out cherry-picked the most experienced folks because we had the luxury. Why? Because you don't know what's going to happen in combat. You have no idea what's going to be asked of you. And the one thing that gives you the best chance of survival and being effective is if you're experienced. If you've seen multiple scenarios, admin scenarios, bad weather, takeoff, night, crappy conditions, and fought your way through that over and over again, you're better able to handle those situations in combat. And then lastly, why does experience matter? It not only matters in a fighter squadron to be ready to fight our nation's wars, it matters to have pilots that are experienced in those staffs. What is more important than providing the best military advice to our senior decision makers on how to use military force? Well, if you don't have combatants informing the senior decision makers on how to use force, you'll misuse air power. You'll misuse military force. And when we don't have fighter pilots, bomber pilots, combatants in the staffs will make poor resourcing decisions, will make poor policy decisions, will make poor go-to-war decisions. And that is the worst thing that can happen, is that a misuse of the air power that we have. And so it's a problem that you see only when you've been at some of those levels, that not having fighter pilots and bomber pilots and combat pilots at the staffs is a huge issue. And that is a function of neglect of many, many years now. And it's a problem that not only exists in the squadrons, but all the way up. So it's very important that the Air Force address this.
You know, I'll say, Gus, also all four of us have seen exactly what you said. What happens when you don't have air power expertise? Bad decisions are made. Airmen have to be there to really advise on how to use it right. Let's take another piece of this. General Sasseville, you know, when this airman decides to leave active duty, they want to change things up and they want to serve on a part-time basis. Just looking back on your experience, how frequent was it for an experienced pilot to leave active duty and transition to a reserve or guard unit?
Thanks. During my time, it was actually quite frequent. So this is 1999, when I separated from the Air Force and joined the DC National Guard. That was a high op tempo time frame. I had 14 years under my belt of active component time. And that part was a bit unusual, but it wasn't uncommon to see people leaving the active component just to slow down their tempo, to raise their families and still contribute. And that's really where I was in a mental state. I thought also at the time, you know what, I'm probably going to end up at the airlines anyway. So why not have the best of both worlds? Why not start my airline career early? Do part-time work with a guard, deploy as needed, keep my skills sharp. I knew as an experienced guy, after 14 years of all flying, no staff work, by the way, which is kind of cool, I wouldn't need a lot to sustain myself in terms of repetitions. So I think that was the case back then. I think it still is right now. I think it's very dependent on the economy, the state of the economy, and how the airlines are doing right after a 9/11. Completely different story, as their airlines were going through their gyrations, and the entire industry was hit hard. But right now, I'm pretty sure it's pretty much the same, with folks voting with their feet and trying to yet continue to serve, but starting to work on the second parts of their lives. So having said all that, though, what's the so what? And I think the so what is the Air Force needs to, and I think there is a little bit of this, accept the reality that we're not going to be able to compete to keep pilots in the Air Force with the way things are going at the airlines. It's a fundamental skill. It's very lucrative to go on the outside. Not everybody will. Not everybody has the desire to become an airline pilot, but we have to understand that that is a reality, and we have to have an approach that accommodates both needs in this fight for human talent. Again, several years ago, the Air Force took a stab at trying to work with some airlines to figure out how to do that exactly. What does that really look? How do we share the resource, if you will, airline first, or do you go, military route first and then switch back and forth? But I think that that's something that we need to look at quite rigorously in order to augment what we're talking about here, which is keeping experience in the reserve component.
Hey, let me follow that up a bit, inject this as you're talking. Is, Heather had the slide that shows the reduction in infrastructure, squadrons. Is it important to keep the reserve components on a par, keep those units open so there are places for the active duty to go, rather than just suddenly vaporize 10, 12, 14 years of experience?
Oh, it's absolutely critical, right? And it is the reserve component, so you don't need to run it as hard as you run the actives. And when I say that, I'm really talking about training programs. Most of the pilots that join are experienced, and like I said, just like myself, we had a pretty good formula. It got a little muddled, I think, throwing sims in there for wrap counters, right? You know, you've got to fly so many times, and uh, and so that confused it a little bit. But the bottom line is, you need a repository of, you need a place where pilots can hone their skills. They can continue to contribute to reduce load on the active component as a true reserve component, but you still retain this capacity for future use. And actually, we're not just talking about the pilots, we're talking about the maintainers and all the support pieces, all those skill sets that support the pilots, right? This is part of our challenge. We still need maintainers behind the scenes in this paper, right? We still need all of that to make this core function, as Gus actually accurately points out. This core function requires a lot of support. So if you start to gut your reserve component, you're really starting to eat at the fundamental fabric, I think, of the total Air Force.
Yeah, very good. Hey, General Guastella, a little bit, maybe you can talk more. What happens when you don't have the experience you need and you've got a highly inexperienced pilot crew within a squadron? And maybe tag on to that, then why it's so important that you do retain this experience in the Guard or reserve.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, well, we all know flying is a dangerous business. Flying fighters is often even more dangerous. And then when you fly fighters in combat, it's real dangerous if the combat's real. Speaking from experience, you know, I've lost an inexperienced wingman. I didn't lose him, but my squadron lost an inexperienced wingman, shot down by a surface-to-air missile system. Fortunately, recovered him 3 days later in combat. I've lost an inexperienced wingman, or actually in this case, it was an experienced guy who was low on currency, struck the ground, and in combat. There's many cases of losses in combat that are a function of either inexperience or proficiency. And both of those are magnified as the threat goes up. But look at what kind of wars our nation have faced over the last decade. We've been involved in very land-centric, counterinsurgency, close air support type campaigns. The biggest mistakes folks make, other than horrible situations where there's a ground impact, oftentimes could be fratricide or collateral damage. Those are big mistakes in the kinetic world, and we've lost people. Think about it, if we're in a full-on versus peer v peer fight, what kind of mistakes are going to be made, right? What kind of attrition are we going to experience? And the only way to buy down that risk is experience your pilots, you know? And I'll tell you, I bet you a bunch of old fighter pilots agree. If you take a less capable airplane, I'm not going to pick planes here, an older plane, less capable, but you put 4 veteran steely-eyed pilots in there versus brand new aircraft, a lot of times the less capable older plane will prevail based on the cunningness, if you will, of the crews, of the pilots. And you know, it's tough in the fighting 5th and 6th gen and things like that, but you guys know what I'm talking about. And so the point, though, is experience matters tremendously. And the U.S. has always had 2 advantages. We've had the advantage of better airplanes and more experienced pilots. Boy, are we in a world of hurt right now. Our advantage in our capability, and especially look at what we're facing against the China fight, is greatly diminished. They're at peer levels with us, in some cases outsticking us, outreaching us with some of their ordnance. And then how is our experience ratio? When I hear that Chinese 5th gen pilots are flying many more sorties per month than we are, I'm absolutely astonished that we've gotten to this state. And so experience matters. We've learned it in lower end combat of the last 20 years. Certainly we've learned it in the big wars of the past, but I don't want to learn it again the hard way in a full-on campaign. So we have to get after this issue.
Wow, that is powerful also. General Sasseville, let's talk a little bit about retaining that experience. It's also very cost effective, this transition of active duty talent into the reserve components. Why is that the case? Can you give us some detail on that?
So this cost conversation is kind of tricky. It depends on who you're talking to and what level he or she sits at, and it depends what you're talking about. And you can cut this in all sorts of different ways. At the very macro level, if you have 300,000 full-timers, that's going to cost way more than 300,000 part-timers, which is essentially what you have, right? And so from a taxpayer's perspective and what Congress looks at that very macro level, that's probably the case. Down at the micro level, if you've got a force that's already paid for, you can send them, or a force that you haven't paid for and you send them, that's gonna take a bill. You're gonna have to pay not only for the O&M, the gas, the flying hours, and so forth to do what operation, but the part-time force creates a year of execution bill because it's hardly ever programmed. It creates a year of execution bill where you have to pay the man days to actually use the force. So even though you've got a nice reserve capacity, it costs money to put it into play. And that's where you get the conversation, well, the reserve component is more expensive because somebody just got saddled with a short-term bill. So, by the way, this is not an Air Force conversation. This is a joint force conversation. OSD struggles with this. PNR, they go back and forth. There is some work done by RAND recently that tries to lay out the comparisons. So it's a really tricky conversation to have, and it depends what you're trying to get out of it in terms of, are we talking about are we trying to make a force structure decision, or are we trying to make an allocation decision? You really need to start understanding that before you can have an informed cost and cost effectiveness discussion. Right now, and I think we're going to talk about authorities in a bit, so I don't want to take too much time on this topic, but there are some authorities that just got laid in. 12304 Bravo finally got approved by the SecDef, which I'm very excited about. I'm super bullish about. It's been an authority that each service secretary has had previously, but never executed because they never really got the authority from the SecDef to implement that. That just changed recently. And we can talk more about that offline or at another session, but I think that will COCOM related activities inside the budget, which will help with some of these friction points.
And Sass, you were interrupted there you just had a blank for a second there. So what just happened to authorities, could you restate that, please?
So 12304 Bravo has been a service. By the way, the ability to access the reserve component really rests with civilian leadership. And I know that's a friction point. People say, hey, we're not accessible. Well, the fact of the matter is, only the president, the secretary of defense, or the service secretary can involuntarily mobilize anybody to do anything. They've got a lot of combatant commanders out there who really want to drive and get into, hey, we need reserve component here and there and so forth and so on. That's not the case. We've lived off of volunteerism, which is great. That's never going to go away, but that's what we've had a steady diet of recently past couple decades. What just happened recently was the service secretary, 12304 Bravo, was the ability to mobilize for 365 days involuntarily up to 60,000 per service in support of pre-planned COCOM missions. The details are important. So if the Air Force decides to put inside their budget, and that's one of the requirements, combatant command support using, and it can be any kind of combatant command support, using the reserve component, they can involuntarily mobilize now. They've always had the authority, but they didn't really have it because the SecDef hadn't authorized it until recently. A little bit late in my book, but I think that'll be a tremendous asset to relieve some of the pressure on the active component.
Very interesting. We want to get some audience questions in here. We started a little late, so we may press a little late here. I do want to get one last question in, and it really has to do with what the Air Force has been forced to do with respect to reducing program flying hours and also funding for weapon system sustainment. And maybe start with you, Heather. How has this impacted the pilot crisis?
Well, reducing flying hours clearly has an impact on a pilot's ability to fly to their minimum. But really, again, we don't want them to fly to their minimum. We want them to be more capable, more competent than that. Reducing and rating the weapon system sustainment account. So that is the cost to own and operate and spare and repair and maintain those aircraft. When you reduce that, you're no longer getting the mission capable rates that you need to fly the aircraft at the rate that you need. So every squadron has effectively fewer aircraft, fewer sorties than they would otherwise, because they're not funded to get to really maximize the availability of those aircraft. So it really has an adverse impact on our ability to field a combat credible, experienced force at capacity.
I'm curious, General Guastella, what do you think on that also? Pretty much the same, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Air Force has an horribly aging fleet. When you have an aging fleet, the maintenance on an old car goes up. Maintenance on older airplanes goes up. You can't use the older planes at the same sortie rates that you could when they were new. And so it's the perfect storm. You need to produce more pilots. Unfortunately, we don't have the aircraft. The T-7 isn't delivering on time. A lot of issues within the Air Force. We're just sustaining very, very old trainers. Some of the things all of us here on the podcast probably flew some of the airplanes for 40 years ago. They're still out there now trying to keep them going. So it's a huge problem, weapon system sustainment, because you need to fly. And by the way, most of the mistakes that are made out there are in the admin phases of flight, taking off, landing, leading 4 ships through weather at night. That's when mistakes are made and problems occur. Fortunately, though, simulators are doing a phenomenal job at training our 5th gen pilots at the actual set reps and sets of the mission itself. But mistakes are made in admin phases, and that's risky to us. And so it's imperative we fund our weapon system sustainment to generate the aircraft availability to allow our pilots to fly at a rate that gets them experienced.
Very good. Well, we are out of time. We want to spend a little bit of time with some audience questions. We could talk about this all day. It is a really interesting report. General Sasseville, I think what you said about how Heather handled this without boiling the ocean, it makes this very important topic digestible. And I just commend everyone to pick up a copy of this paper. It's online as we speak, and take a look. And so I'd like to thank you all for a great discussion. Now, let's go to some audience questions. We've got Josh Baker, research analyst, in the back room, along with Aidan Poling. Josh, what have you got?
Thanks, Stutz. We have a question from John Turpak from Air and Space Forces magazine. John, please unmute your mic.
Good morning. Thanks. 2 questions. It seems like there's a dozen programs in various stages of implementation right now to overhaul pilot training, reforge, et cetera. Are they working, or are they only just making it more efficient to produce an inadequate level of pilots?
Well, John, I think the service definitely understands the number of pilots that they need to produce. They also understand that they have certain constraints today because they've not had the resources necessary to invest in the pilot training, aircraft, and overall enterprise. The Air Force has been fiscally constrained for 30 years. So they've rightfully tried to prioritize their combat systems, which means they've had to take risk in the pilot training enterprise. So the things they're trying to do regarding reforge, pilot training next, and so forth, and they're even moving into other more innovative and different types of pilot training processes, and leveraging technology and the civil infrastructure and so forth. They're doing everything they can to produce as many pilots as they can at the quality that our squadrons need. The challenge is that even if those investments and those innovations are perfect and can meet the number necessary, first of all, you have to be able to train them through the fighter units. You have to be able to then absorb and experience them in the operational squadrons, which also gets towards the reforge, which is intended to use pilot training aircraft to experience newly operational pilots. But you also have to have the experience to absorb them. And that's really going to be a major challenge. So there are a lot of moving parts. I commend the Air Force for all the efforts they're making, but this is a long-term problem that we're not going to see the outcomes of for 5 to maybe even 10 years. So we have to do what we can to get the fight tonight force. And that ultimately comes down to retaining pilots across the total force, whether it's the active or the reserve component. A pilot that walks and doesn't stay in the total force is a pilot you don't have to go to war.
Can I jump in to just dovetail off of that?
Go ahead.
I think part of to help explain it, as we increase the capacity, and the capacity I think will increase as we produce more pilots, the reserve component units are essentially the shock absorber. As this increase comes through, they need places to learn how to fly, and that takes a long time. So you'll be technically licensed to do it, but you need a lot of OJT. It takes years, and that needs to be done in our current system in the reserve component.
And real quick on retention, is there anything that seems to work that the Air Force isn't doing?
John
They need to
Costello,
grow-
you were part of that. Go ahead.
John, well, I'll just jump in here really quick. John, they need to grow the force.
Yeah.
I think ultimately it all comes down to the Air Force has gotten too small for everything that our nation is asking of it. And the only way to be able to retain pilots across the total force is to grow combat capacity, provide them the training and the readiness that they joined the force to do, so that they can get more balance in their life. We're not burning them out. I mean, retention is just one part of the pilot shortage. A huge piece of this, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, is started in the 1990s when we shrunk the force. The only way to fix the force is to grow.
Thank you.
Josh, next question.
Thanks, Stutz. We have a question again in the chat from Joe Kunzler from Simply Flying. Specifically, he asked, is the Air Force, or should the Air Force consider full-time flying positions to address this pilot shortfall? And then a second question, what does the Air Force need to do, in particular in the Air National Guard, to address the work-life balance issues pertaining to the pilot shortage?
So I'll take a stab at the second one. The work-life balance in the Air Guard it's symptomatic, right? It's gotten tough because I think what the Air Guard would describe itself as now would be a combat-ready reserve. So it maintains its attribute of a reserve, but because it's been used repetitively over the past 3 decades, not 2, as our Army friends like to point out, it is too suffering from a little bit of overuse. And so back to Lucky's point, who did a masterful thing, putting more out there, increasing the PAA, increasing the crew ratio, and getting more Air Force will ease the burden on everybody. And that's really the only way to do it. It's not about ratios. It's not about getting smaller. It's about getting bigger.
I could pitch in maybe with a perspective also and agree with you, Sass. The Air Force has done a heck of a job looking at every possible lever it can to maintain a pilot force that it needs. It looks at production and it absolutely looks at retention. And there's every possible lever that's been looked at. At the end of the day, Heather said it, you got to produce more pilots because some pilots are inevitably going to get out of the Air Force. That's just the way it is. We hope we capture them in the Guard. Their life changes, their needs change, and they're going to get out. Some guys are going to gut it out, just like me, that ran the whole way through, took 4 remotes, deployments, all the things the Air Force threw at me. I loved it. And, and some people are out there are going to stay 20, even longer, 30 years, and just because they feel that. But the only way to get the full mix is to produce the core that they need, so those inevitable life decisions will happen. And absolutely, the Air Force is looking at every way they can to retain in the active those pilots and experienced ones. But if not, the Guard and Reserve offers a perfect place to go. You know, I'll also say this: in those critical staff positions, having an experienced Guard pilot in those is critical when we don't have an active pilot. You know, our Guard and Reserve components provide more than just a combat squadron that can deploy. They can help us in the leadership roles as well, because we just don't have it. So again, thanks for the opportunity to address that question.
Well, I tell you, I wish we could continue. We've got a lot of questions. We're going to cut these questions, we'll print them, and we'll try to get some answers back, because there's some good things here. Heather, I just want to say that Joe Kunzler says, what is it going to take to get Lucky back in a fighter jet as one of America's Top Gun heroes? So the Air Force is about to have at least one pilot more than they have today. So Heather,
You know, the longer it's been, the better I was.
right. Yeah, great job, Heather. Thanks for this fantastic research. And this paper, like I said, is on our website now at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Go check it out. And to General Guastella and General Sasseville, two great generals in Air Force history, thanks for being here today, sharing your insights. We love what you're doing, what you've done in your service, and you continue to serve. And now to our audience, from all of us at Mitchell Institute, have a great air and space power kind of day.